great to be back. We're happy and excited to be home. We had a wonderful time at camp last week, but it's great and it's exciting to be back with your church family worshiping again. I'm excited about this morning's lesson. We've been going through the stories that changed the world. We've been looking at the different parables that Jesus taught to Israel to try to show them how they ought to have a proper relationship with God. And we've been trying to examine our relationship with God in view of all these parables and the lessons that Jesus taught. And the parable of the sower that we'll be looking at this morning is one that acts as a pivot point. Throughout all of these parables that Jesus tells, some of them have to deal with a heart of generosity. Some of them have to deal with having a heart that is loving, that is kind, one that is willing to do and render proper service to God. Maybe having a servant's heart. Maybe they're about having compassion upon the lost. Maybe it's about seeing the Father's love. Well, the parable of the sower deals more individually with each person differently. Because each person has to examine their heart, not to see if they're generous or if they're loving, but to see if their heart is willing to accept the seed being the gospel. And throughout this parable that we'll be looking at this morning, I hope you will be examining your heart. Whether you have obeyed the gospel before, whether you consider yourself saved, lost, found, whatever it might be, I hope you'll examine your heart this morning as I also examine mine. Because in this parable, Jesus describes every single heart in this room. Every heart in this world. At the point someone reaches the age of accountability and the gospel is sprinkled upon their heart, they will respond one of these four ways. And their heart will be represented in one of these four soils. But there is always, as I've said before, a reason, a purpose. What might Jesus' purpose be for telling this parable? Different people have different obstacles that keep them from coming to the gospel. And while they may have specifically a vast range of different obstacles they have to overcome or things that might prevent them from obeying the gospel, it can ultimately be boiled down into these four categories. Read with me, if you will, in Matthew chapter 13. And the first section we're going to read is verses 3 through 8. And then we're going to skip down and read verses 18 through 23. If you don't have a Bible with you this morning, there should be one in a pew around you somewhere. I really encourage you to grab a Bible, follow along. I'm going to have it on the screen here beside me as well. And if you can, follow along there as well. Or if you don't have a Bible with you, but please do follow along with me. We're going to jump a little bit, so be ready for that. Matthew chapter 13, beginning in verse 3. And he told them many things in parables, saying, A sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seeds fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured them. Other seeds fell on rocky ground, where they did not have much soil, and immediately they sprang up, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched. And since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among the thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and produced grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Now skip down with me down to verse 18. Follow along again. Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what he has been sown in his heart. This is what was sown along the path. As for what was sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet he has no root in himself, but endures for a while, and when tribulation or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately he falls away. As for what was sown among thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. As for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it. He indeed bears fruit and yields, in one case 100-fold, in another 60, and another 30. That's Matthew chapter 13, 3 through 8, and 18 through 23. Thank you for following along in that reading with me. The reason I read the two separate parts is because in one place, Jesus is telling the parable to the people. In another place, he's explaining what it means. I've mentioned before in a lesson that I was taking a class on how to understand the Bible. A big word for that is hermeneutics. We had something like that here when I first started a couple of years ago. And it's how to read the Bible and understand it. And interestingly enough, it's how you read anything to understand it. But it helps us develop good problem-solving techniques to find things and explanations for things. And one of the most obvious and beginning points that we always make, and it always is made, is let the Bible explain itself. I can remember one of my first tests that I had in this class. The teacher was Gary Hampton, and he said, "What does this parable mean?" And we each had a section of paper where we wrote down. I remember I wrote a page and a half. And I'm not amazing at writing large amounts, so this was impressive. I put everything I had into it, and what I felt like this meant, and what I thought this meant, and what little nuances there might have been, and the imagery that he was portraying. And about half the class failed the test. And it was just a pop quiz, and so we weren't all devastated, but we were still really concerned. Why did we not get a perfect score on this? I thought I did a great job. And he explained that if we were to read down 15 verses, that Jesus explains it perfectly right there. He said, always let the Bible explain the Bible. Regardless of what training you might have had or have not had, regardless of what sort of education you received, middle school, high school, college, anything beyond, that's simple enough to understand. We use the same tactic, I'll call them, whenever we read the newspaper and we read a book. Well, Jesus explains exactly what he's saying there. And he tells us exactly what all these soils are and how we can identify them, not only in ourselves, but in others. And also what kind of repercussions there are, consequences there are to each of them. This morning I'm wanting us to look at three different aspects of this parable. First, the sower's job, and what a sower's job is. Second, to do a soil inspection, mainly of ourselves, but also of the world around us and being able to recognize these things. Third, the good soil definition. You see, good soil is defined here in this parable. So if I want to be good soil, which I assume we all do, then I need to meet that description. First, a sower's job. Now this may seem extremely obvious. What is a sower's job? What is someone who scatters seed? What is their job? It seems pretty obvious to scatter seed. But, remarkably enough, we still get this wrong sometimes. We still are mistaken as to what our job truly is. We might try to put too much on ourselves, or sometimes even not enough. Turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 3. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, we're going to look at verses 6 and 7 there. While you're turning, a little bit of background. The church at Corinth had a lot of problems. They had a lot of things they had to go through, and a lot of struggles they were going through that Paul addresses in this book. But one that he kicks off right at the beginning, and we see it come up in several different places, is that they had a problem of following people. Now, Paul did admonish Christians to follow him as he followed Christ. But that isn't quite what was going on here. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, a report had come from Chloe's people that they had picked out their favorite preachers, their favorite evangelists, their favorite speakers, maybe the one that they explained it their favorite way. And they had gone to the point where they said, I follow Apollos. I follow Cephas, who was Peter. Or I follow Paul. And some of them would say, I follow Jesus. So they had all these different people they were ascribing to. That sounds kind of familiar today, doesn't it? If I want to go to a different town and look for Christians, I might say that find some that follow the Baptists, some that follow the Methodists, some that follow the Pentecostals, some that follow the Church of God, some that follow the Church of God in Christ, some that follow the Holiness, some that follow the Trinitarians, some that follow the Catholic, some that follow, and I could go on and on and on and on and on. If you want to believe any certain way, chances are you look long enough, you'll find an entire established church, religious institution that says exactly what you want to hear. You can look anywhere and find it. That's very similar to what was going on here at Corinth. You had some people that were wanting to follow this way, and some follow this way. And it was leading them away from Jesus. Now, it may have become something that was impressed upon us that it's our job to be that kind of an individual that leads people to follow me, that I do the work. I save people. In fact, sometimes I use the illustration and pick on everybody that's in the audience. I say, tell me if you've saved someone. And that, without thinking, sometimes people will raise their hand and say, yes, I've saved several people. And what they mean is that they've led people to Christ. or they've showed someone how to be saved. But we often don't think about that. We think if someone decides not to become a Christian, that's my fault. If someone decides not to obey the gospel, then it's me. It's my job to make them do that. That's not our job. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, where I had us turn a minute ago, Paul tells us exactly what our job is. And remarkably, it's not to save people, not to change people. Read there with me, if you will, 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 6 beginning. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. What is our job? To scatter the seed and water it. To place a rock in someone's shoe. To cause them to think about something. To tell them the good news. To be able to let the gospel be out there. It's God that gives the growth. If someone decides not to obey the gospel, that's between them and God. I've done my job. That's what Paul told the Ephesian elders. He said, I have not kept anything back from you. There was nothing I didn't tell you about. There was nothing I was too scared to say. My hands are clean of your blood. That's what Ezekiel was told. Something we'll look at a little bit later is that he was supposed to cry out. And if he did so, he's done his job. Like I said, we'll get more into that in a moment. But our job as an individual, as a collective group, is not to save people. It's not the church's job to save people. That's God's job, and He did it. The only question is, will the individual accept that? So let's make sure we understand what a sower's job is. To scatter the seed, to water it, to keep reminding them of it, but it's not our job to change them. The disciples in Acts chapter 8, if we'll go ahead and turn over there to Acts chapter 8, we're going to look at the first couple of verses. The disciples, during great persecution, did something extremely interesting. Once again, that's Acts chapter 8, the first 4 verses. To give us a little bit of background before we read there, this is right after the stoning of Stephen. Right after the stoning of Stephen, there is persecution mounting on top of persecution. There is a lot of bad things going on in Jerusalem to Christians. And so, as a way to get the gospel out to the world, as well as a response to what is going on, the disciples are scattered. Read there with me in Acts chapter 8. Beginning in verse 1, and Saul approved of his execution. Now his there refers to Stephen, and Saul here is who we will later know as Paul. And there arose on that day a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem. And though they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles, devout men buried Stephen and made great lamentation over him. But Saul was ravaging the church, and entering house after house, he dragged off men and women and committed them to prison. Now those who were scattered went about preaching the word. Philip went down to the city of Samaria, proclaimed to them the Christ. And then goes into the story of Simon the magician and the different things that Philip did. I've had us to look at this passage before in a different lesson, and we were trying to show something different. Before we were showing that it's the individual Christian's job to spread the gospel. And while that may be something we're wanting to talk about, that's not our particular reason for looking at this verse right now. Did you notice what those who were scattered, not the apostles, the Christians, the individual members, what were they doing? Were they going around and wrestling people to the ground, dragging them to the water, and dunking them underneath, telling them, you're going to obey God, you're going to live right from now on, you have to? No. They went around talking about Jesus. They were going about being a witness to what had happened in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost. Being a witness to what Jesus had done in raising from the dead. They were going around being a witness as to the gospel, the good news. That's what they did. That was their job. Their job was to scatter the seed. And that's what we see Philip doing. When he goes and preaches to those who were in Samaria. when he teaches Simon the magician and all those that had been bewitched by him to think that he had the power that was great. He showed them that God had the power that was great. What is the magician? What is a sower's job? It's to scatter the seed. A minute ago we mentioned good news. That's the same side, or different side of the same coin. The seed that we're scattering is good news. It's the gospel. I've mentioned before that the gospel literally is a breakdown of that as Old English, God's spell, a story that God is telling us that's interesting and intriguing. That comes with that Old English there. It literally means good news, the word euangelion, and that's literally what it means. Glad tidings, good news, things that you want to hear. Similar to one who was holding a newspaper saying, extra, extra, read all about it, this great thing that's happened. That's the word for a preacher that's used in the New Testament. Someone that's proclaiming good news. That is a sower's job, to tell good news. Look at the Old Testament at 2 Kings chapter 7 for a moment. 2 Kings chapter 7. While you're turning over there, a little bit of background. Jerusalem is besieged. There are people surrounding Jerusalem. No food's coming in, nothing's coming out. There's no trade. They are starving. Everyone's in chaos. They're worried. They're thinking they're going to die. What's going to happen? Many of them are losing faith in God, not trusting in Him. And there's a prophecy made that by this next day, there will be food sold in Jerusalem. In fact, it'll be sold very cheap. And in the beginning of chapter 7, that's what we open up to. Elisha's promising this food. The captain, on whose hand the king leaned, he told him that's not going to happen. If the Lord Himself could make the windows in heaven open up, could this even happen? He told him you won't see it with your own eyes, you won't even eat it. So that's the background. They're besieged, there's no food, nothing's going on, there's no movement, everyone's thinking they're going to die. And in the midst of this, something happens. There were some lepers. Verse 3 says, now there were 4 men who were lepers at the entrance to the gate, this being the gate of the city. And they said to one another, why are we sitting here until we die? If we say, let us enter the city, the famine's in the city, and we'll die there. If we sit here, we'll die also. So now come, let us go over to the camp of the Syrians. If they spare our lives, we shall live. And if they kill us, we shall but die. So they arose at twilight to go to the camp of the Syrians. Let's pause there for a moment. This makes kind of sense, doesn't it? These are lepers. They were cast out of the rest of the people. They couldn't be around. If they came near to someone, they had to hold a finger over their nose, say, unclean, unclean, don't come near me, I have leprosy. And they said, if we go into the city, there's famine there, we'll die. If we stay here, we're going to starve to death, we're going to die. Maybe if we go into the Syrians, they'll be merciful and want to give us food. And if they're not, then we'll just die. We have nothing to lose. So they're going out at twilight to the camp of the Syrians, and look what happens. But when they came to the edge of the camp of the Syrians, behold, there was no one there. Then we're told a little backstory. For the Lord had made the army of the Syrians hear the sound of the chariots and of the horses, the sound of a great army. So they said to one another, behold, the king of Israel has hired against us the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Egypt to come against us. So they fled away in the twilight and abandoned their tents, their horses, and their donkeys, leaving the camp as it was, and fled for their lives. And when these lepers came to the edge of the camp, they went into a tent and ate and drank, and they carried off silver and gold and clothing and went and hid them. Then they came back and entered another tent and carried off things from it and went and hid them. And then they realized something. Have you ever been so caught up in a moment that you didn't realize really what you were doing, and then all of a sudden something hits you, and you freeze and stop in your tracks and come to some great realization? Well, that seems to be what happened here. They stopped in their tracks, and then notice what they said. Verse 9, then they said to one another, we are not doing right. This is a day of good news. We are silent and wait until the morning light, punishment will overtake us. Now therefore come, let us go and tell the king's household. So they went and told them that the army's gone, all their food and provisions are there. This was a day of good news. They had an obligation. They had to report. They had to tell everyone. The Syrians are gone, their camp is empty. There's gold, there's silver, there's food, there's stuff to drink. This was a day of good news. That's our job. And they had a burden on them to tell that good news. We don't usually have a problem telling good news, do we? Something good happens to us, we tell everyone we see. In fact, we'll call up people that we don't usually see just to let them know this good thing has happened to us. We like to tell good news. We're good at it. In Ezekiel chapter 3 and verse 16, I mentioned this a moment ago, God calls him Israel's watchman. If the army's coming against the city and he doesn't cry out, danger, danger, then the blood's on the watchman's hands. But if he cries out, danger, danger, and they don't take cover, then it's on their own heads. Well, he's Israel's watchman. When God sends him a message for Israel, if he doesn't tell them and warn them, then it's his fault they perish. But if he tells them and they don't listen, that's on them. It's kind of what we were talking about a minute ago. The burden's on us to tell good news. Just because we have rejection, just because people don't listen, don't believe us, whatever it might be, that doesn't change our job as sowers. We're to tell good news. We're to scatter the seed, and that's it. Water it every once in a while, but you can't make it grow. Now this brings us to the purpose, really, of the parable. A soil inspection. What kind of soil do you have? What does your heart look like? What's there? If we were to come around and examine one by one and hold up this measuring line that Jesus gave us with these 4 soil types, what would it look like with you? In Matthew chapter 12, verses 33 through 37, Jesus is very clear how important the heart is. And the heart has quite a lot of importance. Not only here, but we see throughout the Bible, emphasis is placed on what's in your heart. Matthew chapter 12, verse 33 says, either make the tree good and its fruit good, or make the tree bad and its fruit bad. For the tree is known by its fruit. You brood of vipers, how can you speak good when you are evil? For out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. The good person out of his good treasure brings forth good, and the evil person out of his evil treasure brings forth evil. I tell you, on the day of judgment, people will give account for every careless word that they speak. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. What's the point he's making? What kind of fruit do good trees produce? Good fruit. What kind of fruit do bad trees produce? Bad fruit. So if I see good fruit, it's an example, it's evident of what's in my heart. If I see bad fruit, that's evidence of what's in my heart. If I respond to the gospel in a certain way, then that's evidence of what's in my heart. By the same token, if I don't respond to the gospel a certain way, that's evidence of what's in my heart. That isn't judging someone's motives. That's inspecting the fruit. Jesus called us to be fruit inspectors. He called us to judge with righteous judgment. What he's talking about when he says, judge not lest you be judged, the most misquoted verse in all of Scripture, misunderstood, is to not just judge with unrighteous judgment. Don't put your judgment over here to them as one thing, and to me, I'm holding myself to a different standard. Have right scales. Something that God spoke about over and over in the Old Testament. Don't have your scales misweighted for your benefit. Don't try to pervert justice there. Same book, Matthew chapter 15, has a lot of the similar wording there in verse 17 of chapter 15. He's bringing out the same point, but this in a different application. They had a problem with Jesus. They were very upset. The Pharisees did not like the way Jesus handled things. Verse 17 Do you not see that whatever goes into the mouth passes into the stomach and is expelled? But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this defiles a person. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile a person. Jesus didn't follow all the traditions they had from their fathers. He didn't keep their guidelines, their man-made rules that they had that they thought made them more holy. He said, that's not what defiles a person. What defiles a person is what comes from inside here. What defiles a person is what's inside the heart. The heart's very important. And it's something we can recognize. Not only in ourselves, but in others. And it's our job and our duty to help plant the seed and water it. To make sure that we're doing all that we can. Just to remind us of what Jesus said here in this parable. The wayside soil, the soil that was along the path, it's been trodden underfoot a lot. It's very firm. It's very stiff. When the soil is scattered on it, this untilled land that's not soft, it just sits on top there. They don't even accept it. They're so hardened that it doesn't even penetrate. And the evil one, the enemy, comes and snatches it away. Perhaps they've grown so abrasive to the message that they won't even hear it. It just goes in one ear and out the other. That's one soil that Jesus describes here. And there's another, the stony soil, the rocky soil. Even though the seed is planted there and it takes root, it doesn't have any depth. Perhaps they felt a lot of emotion and they really just felt bad after hearing a message or felt really good after hearing some message of good news that somebody presented, but they don't put in any depth. And the first time they're persecuted, they have some sort of bad experience because of being a Christian, believing in God, they wither away like a plant with shallow roots. That's another type of heart that Jesus describes here. He describes the third one, the thorny soil, where there's brambles, bushes, and those thorns, those cares of the world choke it out. Even though the gospel was implanted there, and even though the roots have some depth, there's been other things allowed to grow around it and take precedent there alongside it. And the fruit that God asks for can't grow alongside these weeds of the world. They can't coexist. It will choke it out, strangle it, keep it from growing and producing fruit. And then the last soil that Jesus described is the good soil. Not only is it the soil that grows and produces fruit, but it spreads. Did you notice that? It's the one that spreads. It reproduces. It grows. The last thing that I really want to spend some time on is this idea of what a good soil looks like. Because, as I mentioned in the beginning of the message, we want to have a good heart. We want to have good soil that's conducive to growth. Whether we have already accepted God, decided to follow Him, whether we've already obeyed the gospel or not, we want to continue and maintain that good cultivated soil. We want to make sure that we have a place that's conducive for growth. Back in Matthew chapter 7 and verse 15, we kind of already touched on this idea. Where does good fruit come from? It comes from a good tree. Where do we find fruit being produced? We find it coming from the places that are prepared for that. The decisions that are made to cause that place to be conducive to growth. Let's apply that to John 14:15. If you love God, if you love Him, what are you going to do? You're going to keep His commandments. Now let's be very clear, because people misunderstand this quite often. Jesus wasn't saying, this is how you have love for me. He wasn't saying, this is how you show people how much you love me. He's not saying this is how you grow to love me. What Jesus is saying is, when you love me, this is what you'll see. A lot of people think, if I do the things that the Bible says, then I'll be okay. No. When you love Jesus, when you love God, you'll do what He tells you to do. It's not the other way around. Obedience doesn't produce love. Love produces obedience. Now, it is true that possibly over time you could grow to love what you're doing. But a foundation built on works leads right where Israel went. To where, if you ask any Israelite, did you love God? They'd say yes. In fact, they said it every morning in their prayers. They said it several times a day. They'd tell you they love God. But they got so wrapped up into keeping commandments, they lost their way. They let it override the love. So that when they got angry at Jesus for healing a man on the Sabbath. Healing a man on the Sabbath. Yet if their ox had fallen in a hole, they would come pull it out on the Sabbath. Hypocrisy was born. Because the love didn't come first. The love wasn't in the right place. Good soil reproduces. We looked in Acts already once, at Acts chapter 7 and 8. In Acts chapter 2, after this Pentecost sermon that Peter preaches, as we have recorded in Acts, and after all these other apostles have also been delivering these lessons in different languages, there are a lot of people added to the church. And it continues. If you want a good recipe to how to have a growing church, look in Acts chapter 2, verses 42 down to verse 47. They were devoted to the apostles' teaching. They were devoted to fellowship. They were devoted to the breaking of bread. They were devoted to prayers. All came upon every soul. Many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. All who believed were together and had everything in common. They were selling their possessions and belongings, distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. They were day by day attending the temple together, breaking bread in each other's homes, received their food with glad and generous hearts. They were praising God and had favor with all the people. Notice what it says next. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. You want to have day by day additions to the church, and have day by day Christians. Have a day by day faith. Very quickly, over in chapter 6 and verse 7, you have very similar things said. In fact, the congregation in Jerusalem has recently had their first problem. Some of the Hellenist widows, as the Greek-speaking widows, are being neglected in the daily distribution of food. Remember in Acts chapter 2 where it said they had everything in common and were sharing food, providing for all the needs? Well, that's what had been going on, except some of the Hellenists, the Greek-speaking Jews, the Jews that had been out in the dispersion among the nations, their widows were being neglected. And the apostles dealt with that. They said, we should not leave praying and teaching to wait on tables. Let give that job to someone else. And they found people out from among them and chose people that could solve that problem. And they did a very good, tactful job of fixing that. And what came out of that? There in chapter 6 and verse 7, and the word of God continued to increase, and the number of the disciples multiplied greatly in Jerusalem. And a great many of the priests became obedient to the faith. They were growing. They were multiplying. They converted the priests. There were many priests who were converted to Christianity. These were the people that were organizing the killing of Jesus. The leaders of the religion. They were being converted. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, Paul gives Timothy a 4-generation plan. He said, you've watched me. You've seen me in the presence of many witnesses deliver up these same things, these great truths, you might say. He said, give these to faithful men who can teach others also. It's a 4-generation plan. Paul, Timothy teaching others, who will then teach others. That is how you grow. That's how you make disciples. That's how you have multiplication going on. good soil reproduces. Good soil produces fruit out of a love and compassion for God. I want to leave us with a question this morning. Every heart is herein described, as we said before. Which is yours? Where do you fit right now? Are you residing in some stony soil? Maybe you have some emotion that has built you up and made you decide to become a Christian, but nothing is growing in any depth. And the first time you have to suffer for Christianity, is that going to be it? Or maybe do you have some thorny soil that, yeah, you come to church sometimes, or maybe you do a few things for God during the week, but for the most part, you have other things that are more important. Some things out in the world that just take up way too much time for you to be a Christian all the time. Is that where you're residing right now? Or maybe you haven't really enjoyed yourself during any of this because you're fitting more to the wayside. And all this is kind of going in one ear and out the other. You're not happy about being here. You're just here because you feel like you're obligated to be or you need to be. Maybe that's where you're sitting. If you're not a good soil, if you're not one that's reproducing, one that's multiplying, if you're not one that's growing, do something about it this morning. The good news, as defined by Paul, is the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. He says in Romans chapter 6, that's because when we are baptized, we're baptized into His death. We're buried. Not in a grave made of stone or earth, but one made of water. And we rise up a new person to walk a new life, just as Christ was raised from the dead. If you want to decide to die today, if you want to decide to live an entirely new life today, won't you do it right now? All together we stand and sing a song of encouragement.